Ongoing U.S. operations tied to Iran are driving a rapid drawdown of munitions, putting new pressure on the defense industrial base. While billions have already been invested to expand production, questions remain about how resilient that system really is under stress. To explore what matters most right now, I'm joined by the director of the Center for the Industrial Base at CSIS, Jerry McGinn. Jerry, it's great to have you on the show. Thanks for joining me.
It's great to be with you, Terry.
We got a very timely topic. You focus on the industrial base, and you have a new piece out looking specifically at the munitions industrial base. And certainly with current operations, that's been in the news a lot. That space got billions of dollars from last year's One Big Beautiful Bill Act. There's talk about a $200 billion supplemental. What really is the state of the munitions industrial base right now?
Yeah, well, thanks, Terry. Great question. We have put a fair amount of money into the munitions industrial base. The One Big Beautiful Bill had $25 billion focusing on munitions. But the challenge is presidents of both parties keep using them. So we've used them in the Midnight Hammer last summer with the first attack on Iran. Used them for other operations for Maduro around Christmas last year. So we've been using them and expanding them, and they're very costly to build and take some time. So we have to build both the depth and what I call the breadth of the industrial base in munitions.
Not only our own use, but we've been providing them to allies, right?
That's correct. Yeah, we've provided at least Patriots and 155 munitions in Ukraine, and some of our allies have provided those too. And we're doing co-production of Patriots in Poland, for instance.
So the early estimates from the current operation in Iran were $1 billion a day in predominantly munitions costs, and that's a pace that most people didn't anticipate. Based on what you're seeing, what is our real capacity to rebuild that? How long does it take? What are the glitches in the supply chain?
Yeah, I think we did use a lot in the beginning, and I think that we used the real standoff weapons. We know like Tomahawk and theater air missile defense and Patriot. Those are really expensive munitions, and so we used those beginning. But now that they've established air dominance, they're using less expensive kind of munitions like laser guided bombs, for instance. So I think the rate of expenditure will be in terms of costs not as great, but we do have this chronic challenge of how do we rebuild and replenish our stockpiles, and so I think that's what was, as you mentioned, the supplemental request by the administration, getting more of these munitions kind of built, and I think there are some chronic challenges to address, but some of it just is money, but also what types of munitions we buy.
Let's start with the money first. We throw $25 billion at it, maybe more. Where does that money go? What's most important to spend it on?
Yeah, I think if you looked at that $25 billion, it went to things like Patriot, Tomahawk, the JASSM missile, and the challenge is those are the numbers add up pretty quick, and so $25 billion sounds like a lot of money, but it didn't buy that much in those exquisite munitions.
When we think about buying the munitions, though, sometimes we think that money is buying the missile in the box. Talk to me about the complexity of the supply chain to put a missile together.
Yeah, no, I think one of the challenges is, these incredibly capable munitions. But, they were developed over many years, and they're very exquisite in terms of the materials involved. And essentially, a lot of them are handmade, So scaling production, you can't just stamp them out like one every other day. It takes, up to a month to build some of these munitions. And then they do have some long lead items or challenges like solid rocket motors and so on. And that's been a lot of the focus recently, is like, how do we get rid of these and address these supply chain bottlenecks? And you see there was a number of large deals that were signed between the Department of the War, Department of Defense, and companies. And that was around both the munitions themselves, but also some of those subcomponents.
So there's specialty materials, unique metals. What about the workforce? Do we have the workforce to actually scale up production in this capacity?
I think companies respond to incentives, right? And so if the government lays out multi-year contracts that they're clearly going to buy this amount of munitions or this amount of this weapon system, companies can respond to that and they'll adjust their workforce. So I think the workforce for these items, I think is just going to respond to the demand signal from contracts.
I'm speaking with Jerry McGinn. He's the director for the Center for the Industrial Base at CSIS. Jerry, one of the ideas that's gaining some traction is having the government take an equity stake in key defense contractors to stabilize capacity. What's your thought on that? Is that a way to help address some of these capacity shortfalls that we're talking about?
Well, one of the things the government is doing is they are making longer-term commitments. They are doing things such as when they invested in rare earths last year with MP Materials, which is the largest producer of rare earths in the United States, they did a 10-year agreement, an offtake agreement, with a guaranteed price floor. So that gave stability for the MP Materials to know they're going to have that much demand. They also included a government-backed loan, $150 million through the Office of Strategic Capital, and then a private sector loan of up to $1 billion. And so those components were significant in helping stabilize demand. The additional thing they added was this government equity stake you're talking about. This is not something that the U.S. government has done. I mean, there have been one or two cases in the past 100 years. It's not a traditional practice. So it's not clear how that's going to work out in time, but that is what the government is trying to do is create some stability in demand and really kind of make the environment ripe for investment in this area.
Jerry, we've talked predominantly about the really expensive, exquisite, precision-guided munitions, but you make the case that there are a lot of other things we need to add to our portfolio of munitions that could help us be more successful at lower cost. Walk us through what the other pieces should be.
Yeah, the way I talk about it is sort of that we need breadth. In some ways, I'm not sure we're ever going to have enough depth because we use the munitions. So we need cheaper, less expensive alternatives that can cover a range of missions. They're not going to do the same things as some of these exquisite missiles, but they can get us like 85% there. And that is things such as short-range, attritable, low-cost drones, such as there was one, an Iranian drone called the Shahed, which we actually reverse engineered and deployed in Epic Fury. It's called Lucas, low-cost munitions. I forget what that exactly stands for. But they deployed those. And they're also doing this drone dominance program in the Department of Defense, which is a lot of startups are engaged. But the other area, which I think is really, really important, is they're developing what's called the Family of Affordable Mass Munitions, or FAM. And so the whole idea there is that, as we talked about, the real exquisite munitions that we build today are really, essentially handmade, and you can't really scale. You can scale production to a degree, but you can't just really crank out missiles. So the whole idea of this family of affordable mass munitions is like building missiles that are good enough, that have about 85% of the capabilities, but you can build them much faster, have more producible, have more common parts so you don't have supply chain issues, and then you can sort of build to print, where you can have contract manufacturing almost to them. So that's a big focus, and I think a really, really smart investment that is coming from principally the Air Force has been leading that effort.
Certainly, Secretary Hegseth's arsenal of freedom implies that they want to do this in a broad way.
Yep.
Are you seeing any impact from those early movements?
Yeah, I think this reflects some of that. The focus on the big deals, of really kind of doing investments, I think is one. These low-cost drones as well as low-cost missiles, that emphasis. And interestingly, another focus that doesn't receive as much attention is there is actually a focus on co-production. That is kind of working with our allies and partners. Like I mentioned, in Poland, they're building Patriots. They also build Patriots and Standard missiles in Japan. And so there are efforts to, you essentially can increase production by, with a little help from your friends.
Let's back out a little bit again and then kind of look at the overall lessons we're learning right now from current operations. When you think about it and you study the defense industrial base broadly, are there places where you see the industrial base as being especially fragile and places maybe where it's proved to be more robust than you expected?
Yeah, I think the industrial base is all about responding to incentives. So I think the government sets the market and they regulate the market. And so they have tremendous power to really send market signals that the companies will respond to. And I think that's what I think is a really strong focus of, Secretary Hegseth's Arsenal of Freedom approach. It lays out kind of those areas. And I think you're seeing companies respond. I mean, I think there are going to be ups and downs along the way. Like one of the things that the department has been focusing on, these other transactions authorities. How do we prototype systems? And that's great. But the problem is, what does that lead to? Does it lead to just prototypes, or what do you produce, right? So that's where you've got to kind of go from experimentation and prototyping and demonstrations to production, and that's tougher than saying it. And so I think that's an area where we'll see how the industrial base responds and how government can incentivize them.
Well, this administration certainly has put a focus on the industrial base, perhaps more than we've seen in quite a while, and money toward it. If policymakers really want to know whether these investments are working, what indicators should they be watching? Not just production numbers, but competitiveness, capacity. How would you measure it?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think there are several ways. One of the ways is, again, setting up measures because, as I mentioned, like there have been a big emphasis on experimentation and prototyping, but we don't really know how many of these prototyping efforts translate to production. So understanding that better helps us understand how much innovation is working. And I think we do have to measure production rates. We have to look at levels of competition. And I think the government, to be fair, is doing very strong here. Is they're really focused on not just developing systems that we produce for 50 years by one vendor, but how do we have multiple vendors providing the same or similar products. So that way you've got a more robust, diverse industrial base. And you're seeing that on the prototyping stage now, and now I want to get there on the program stage.
So a year from now, what will you be watching for to see if these investments have paid off?
I'll be watching things like the Air Force's Collaborative Combat Aircraft. So they have 3 companies producing prototypes. A traditional company, Boeing, a company that's long been in the UAV space, General Atomics, and a newer company, Enduro, right? And so I'll be interested to see how those develop, how many do they build from each of those companies, who's more successful, who struggles, and then what do they do with the next phase of that? So how they kind of incentivize and then, and how companies respond is what I'll be watching.
I've been speaking with Jerry McGinn, Director for the Center for the Industrial Base at CSIS. Jerry, thanks so much for joining me.
Really great to be with you again, Terry.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.